Pause the video and think about how you would answer these questions. The education system in Ukraine is oriented towards entering the unified global informational and educational space. This process is accompanied by radical changes and corrections in the educational process. Special attention is drawn to the development of foreign language education, the study of language policy priorities in Ukraine and the world, the study of the foundations of native and multilingual education, the formation of intercultural tolerance by means of native and foreign languages, the development of linguistic and communicative competence of different categories of the population, and the study of the pedagogical and psychological foundations of the formation of a communicatively competent personality. Language education in Ukraine has gone through a long and difficult path. For a long period, education was conducted in Latin, Russian, Polish, or German, which influenced the complex process of culture formation. For the first time, the teaching of foreign languages on the territory of Ukraine was introduced in the Austro-Greek Slavic Latin Academy in 1576. The practice of teaching foreign languages gradually spread to other universities and gymnasiums of Ukraine thanks to the experience of the Austro Academy. The study of foreign languages was also practiced as compulsory in fraternal schools. The study of the Greek language in fraternal schools was based on the principle of learning about ancient culture and supporting the cultural ties of the Eastern Slavs with Byzantium. Learning the Greek language allowed students not only to be able to write competently and quickly read philosophical works in Greek, but also to communicate freely in class. It was in the fraternal schools that bilingual education in Church Slavonic and Greek was first introduced. The Kiev Collegium initiated the study of several foreign languages, in particular, Latin, Greek, Old Hebrew, and German. Skovoroda, Prokopovich, who themselves practiced teaching foreign languages and worked on translations of world literature into Ukrainian, were among the outstanding graduates of the Kiev Collegium. It is necessary to note the global trend of spreading the Latin language in educational institutions of Ukraine. Similar to European universities, where teaching the courses of rhetoric, poetics, and philosophy was based on the Latin language, in educational institutions of Ukraine they began to introduce teaching in Latin. Also important was the fact that in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, Latin was not only the language of legislation, but also the language of diplomacy, justice, and philosophy. In the 19th century, new types of educational institutions began to appear: gymnasiums. The study of foreign languages in gymnasiums was determined by following the cultural European tradition. Special attention was paid to the problem of learning foreign languages in pre-revolutionary gymnasiums. Starting from 1804, the professional training of teachers of ancient languages had a pronounced cultural nature with an emphasis on ancient culture and was initially carried out in linguistic departments of universities. Despite the spread of foreign languages in pedagogical education, their study in secondary school in the 20s of the 19th century began to fall sharply. The nature of further educational reforms of the second half of the 19th century significantly influenced the narrowing of the general cultural and general educational role of foreign languages, both ancient and new. The analysis of the historical and pedagogical literature on the problem of the development of language education on the territory of Ukraine during the rule of the Russian Empire shows that in secondary schools and gymnasiums of the 19th and early 20th centuries the leading trend of language education was the study of classical and new, European, foreign languages. In schools, 16 lessons a week were devoted to learning Latin. Starting from the first grade, students mastered grammar. From the second grade they mastered reading, read the works of the classics, and by the third grade they mastered the language sufficiently. The peculiarity of teaching the Latin language was that it was studied in comparison with the Russian language. Thus, in the second grade, the first hour was devoted to translations from the Russian language into Latin, and in the third grade, to composition of poems in Latin. Up to 16 lessons per week were conducted for their acquisition in all fourth grades. As in the case of learning a classical language, grammar was studied in the first grade, translations were the main focus in the second grade, reading and writing in the third grade, prose and poetry reading, writing one's own works in the fourth grade. Foreign languages were also studied in women's secondary educational institutions, but the curricula were significantly different from those of men. Thus, in female gymnasiums, the number of hours devoted to the study of languages was much lower. Also, language courses were not mandatory and were held for an additional fee. Starting from the 20th century, university pedagogical institutes and two-year pedagogical courses trained teachers of ancient languages. In turn, these teachers were able to implement their skills and knowledge only in the newly created gymnasiums. According to the Statute of Gymnasiums and Secondary Gymnasiums in the Russian Empire, 1864, gymnasiums were divided into two types, classical and real. Ancient languages were mostly studied in classical gymnasiums, and the main emphasis in education was on exact sciences. In real gymnasiums, the main emphasis was on the study of natural sciences, and language education in real gymnasiums was based on the study of so-called new languages, German, French, English. A significant difference between real and classical gymnasiums was that only graduates of the latter received the right to further education. This was due to the specifics of university education, where studies were mostly conducted in Latin. On July 30, 1871, classical gymnasiums were divided into gymnasiums and progymnasiums. In the latter, according to the new requirements, the number of hours for language study was significantly increased. Thus, instead of 28 hours of Latin in classical gymnasiums, 37 weekly hours were introduced in progymnasiums. There was a similar increase in the number of hours for the study of the Greek language in progymnasiums. Another feature was that the study of new languages was introduced from the second year of high school. So, if Latin and Greek were studied during the first to third year, Latin, the first year, Greek from the third year, then the study of new languages took place in the second year. This was mostly due to the difficulty of learning several languages, which represented different language systems. Therefore, it is not uncommon for secondary schools to include only one or two new languages in the curriculum. In 1872, the status of real gymnasiums was changed to real schools. The peculiarity was that in real schools, students could receive only secondary education, and did not have the right to enter universities upon graduation. Therefore, receiving a classical education, namely the study of ancient languages, Latin, Greek, became the only way to obtain further higher education, which undoubtedly affected the quality and level of training of future applicants. A peculiarity of language education in Western Ukraine was the wide spread of the German language. But the problem of its study was the lack of appropriate didactic materials. Thus, at the teachers' meeting in Vienna in 1867, the best teachers of Galicia and Bukovina were tasked with compiling Ukrainian language textbooks for learning a foreign language. The content and structure of foreign language textbooks published in Austria fully corresponded to the pedagogical standards of that time, and had a huge impact on their distribution on the territory of Ukraine. For a long time, Austrian textbooks were simply translated into Ukrainian, but later teachers began to compile their own textbooks using the same didactic principles. Ukrainian manuals underwent a rigorous review and, after a long procedure of analysis and discussion, were submitted to the Ministry of Education for approval. In the second half of the 19th century, folk schools appeared, which were the initial stage of education for children from 6 to 14 years old. They were implemented with the passing of the law on changing trivial schools to folk schools. According to the law on compulsory primary education introduced by the Bukovina Sejm in 1870, basic requirements for teachers and students were defined. The study period was 8 years. Upon completion, students had the right to enter secondary school. Secondary education was represented by classical and real gymnasiums, women's schools, and lyceums. It was mostly a link between primary and higher education, but was not universally compulsory. After graduation, students had the right to work in state institutions or continue their studies at universities. A feature of gymnasiums was the introduction of new languages into the curriculum, German, French, or English. According to the new curriculum, which was introduced for real gymnasiums in 1877, the study of the French language became compulsory. Also, the reforms of the educational system provided for taking into account the ethnic characteristics of the region and the correspondence of language education to the study of natural and mathematical or humanitarian disciplines. The creation of women's educational institutions in Halakina and Bukovina was also important. The purpose of women's schools and lyceums was to teach girls mostly natural and humanitarian disciplines, excluding the classical component of gymnasium education. So, most of the initial time was allocated to studying foreign languages. The task of these institutions was to prepare girls for women's professions. An interesting aspect is the formation of bilingual schools in Transcarpathia, Halakina, and Bukovina. Thus, according to the legislation, the official language of Austria was German, but according to the law on the equality of peoples, Ukrainians had the right to study in their native language. This led to the emergence of the so-called Utraquist, bilingual, schools. In Bukovina, they mostly studied in Ukrainian, German and Romanian. Ukrainian, German and Hungarian languages were popular in Transcarpathia. In Halakina, Polish, German and Ukrainian. The peculiarity of these schools was that half of the subjects were taught in their native language, the other half in the language of the ruling government, Hungarian, German, Polish. According to Austrian legislation, in settlements with a mixed type of population, the creation of such Utraquist, bilingual, schools was compulsory. The activity of Utraquist, bilingual, schools had a negative impact on the level of knowledge acquisition. This was due to the lack of a clear division of educational subjects, which had to be conducted in the state and native languages. The study of the German language in Bukovina was allowed only to those students who knew the Ukrainian language, and therefore the study of other languages, Greek, French and English, was considered not so important. In general, comparing the situation of language education in the West and the East, it is possible to note a higher quality level of language education in the western region of Ukraine. The level of social security and educational policy in these regions was significantly higher than in the eastern regions of the Russian Empire. It is the period of the second half of the 19th century which many researchers consider the period of formation of the domestic system of teaching foreign languages. The first stage, 20 to 40 years of the 19th century. At this stage, the theoretical foundations of teaching foreign languages were created. As noted earlier, foreign languages were just entering the educational system of Ukraine. Thus, in the Ostro Academy, in fraternal schools, through the transfer of practical experience, the basic principles of teaching ancient languages were formed. The second stage, 40 to 60 years of the 19th century. This period is characterized by gymnasiums coming to life, in which language education was made compulsory and had significant methodical assets. Deductive methods were widespread at this stage. The main slogan of the teachers was the study of the grammar of the language. The main means of education were the implementation of written translations and the study of phonetic features of ancient languages. The peculiarities of language education in this period were use of theoretical teaching methods by studying the rules of writing and reading, teaching grammar based on comparison with the grammar of other languages, Russian, Ukrainian, Latin. Lack of general didactic principles of organization of educational material. This stage was characterized by oversaturation of educational material, lack of uniform criteria for assessing the level of knowledge. The third stage, 60 to 90 years of the 19th century. The introduction of inductive methods of teaching foreign languages is in progress. The main reason for their use was the low level of assimilation of knowledge by students when using deductive methods and oversaturation of educational material. The purpose of the inductive method was the formation of practical experience of language proficiency, which involved the creation of a special language environment, increasing the role of self-educational work of students. The basic principles of planning the educational load according to the age and mental capabilities of the students were developed. In classical gymnasiums, curricula were developed for each course. The study of ancient and new languages was separated. The disadvantages of this stage were an increase in the number of working hours and an increase in the educational load, which also led to a low level of knowledge acquisition by students. The fourth stage, 90 years of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. A feature of this stage was the determination of the need to develop qualitatively new methods of learning a foreign language by combining practical and theoretical study of educational material, forming humanistic principles of the pedagogical process. and increasing the role of new languages in the curricula of gymnasiums and universities. The change in the basic principles of language education has led to a decrease in the number of hours for studying ancient languages and to an emphasis on the role of new languages. Summing up, it can be noted that the development and formation of foreign language teaching methods in Ukraine during the research period, both under the rule of Russia and under the rule of Austria-Hungary, took place in stages with changes in the educational system and the creation of general approaches to teaching methods. A significant difference can be considered in the influence of European traditions on the formation of the language education on the territories of Western Ukraine, where the goal was a skillful combination of the native language and learning a foreign language. On the territories of Central and Eastern Ukraine, language education was under constant pressure from the state-building policy of the Russian Empire during the second half of the 19th century. Despite the fact that the level of teaching and education of the population differed in different regions, mastery of at least 2 foreign languages was compulsory for admission to a higher educational institution. In the second half of the 19th century, language education gains new significance with the appearance of new languages courses, which opens up opportunities for the development of humanitarian education and the training of pedagogical personnel in the field of language education at the beginning of the 20th century. Since 1945, English has become the most widely studied foreign language in both Western and Eastern Europe. The acquisition of the dominant position of the English language is connected with its perception as a means of interethnic communication, lingua franca. Ukraine's acquisition of the status of an independent state presented it with many tasks in the field of education and culture. Since the 80s of the 20th century, the question of reforming school education has arisen. Although, according Haluzinski, educational reforms in Ukraine took place earlier, almost at the same time as in most foreign countries. At the beginning of the 90s of the last century, a number of fundamental documents were adopted, which were supposed to raise the existing education system to a qualitatively new level, and also contributed to updating the content of foreign language learning as one of its components. Educational processes in Ukraine have taken the path of integration into the European educational space. Creation of an open educational space is aimed at simplifying access to education for all age groups, at creating a system of so-called bridges in order to make possible the transition from one field of study to another, or from one education system to another, in order to be able to accumulate previous educational achievements and to be sure that obtained credits and qualifications will be recognized throughout the EU. In higher educational institutions of the humanitarian direction in Ukraine, the study of a foreign language is included in the compulsory list of disciplines. Thus, the main purpose of its study for specialists in certain fields has become the use of a foreign language as a real means of communication between specialists of different countries, and a means of independent familiarization with documents and primary sources in the original language. English as a subject has many options, for example, language for general purposes, language for academic purposes, language for special purposes, language for science and technology, language of narrowly professional use, language for business communication, etc. In secondary educational institutions, the main focus is on learning a foreign language for general purposes, but in high school, it may be studied partly for academic purposes, and in specialized, also partly, language for special purposes and for business communication. Since the 1990s in Ukraine, in the foreign language teaching methodology, the search for ways of interconnected communicative, socio-cultural and cognitive development of the student has been started based on their knowledge of a foreign reality and perception of another culture. The concept of intercultural education appears, and the principle of multilingualism and multiculturalism is proclaimed in language education, which should promote the social and academic mobility of young people. The latter are designed to help a person feel that they belong to their native people and at the same time realize themselves as a citizen of the country and a subject of a multicultural and multilingual world civilization. Pause the video and think about how you would answer these questions.